Well, greetings, fellow humans, and welcome. Today I am re-entering the realm of costuming nonsense, and I'm going to be patterning and mocking up some 1770s stays. Now, the pattern I'm going to be drafting is from Stays and Corsets by Mandy Barrington. I've used this book before to make my Regency Short Stays about this time last year, I think, and it went pretty well. It's a really good book, and it lays out very carefully, very specifically, very clear instructions for drafting the shape of the pieces that you need for making various historical undergarments. It does not, however, lay out any clear instructions, or any instructions whatsoever, for marking out boning or cording channels, or any construction techniques. So there's going to be a reasonable amount of figuring out with this one.
The instructions in the book start with directions on how to draft a basic bodice block to your measurements. I could then start on the specific instructions for drafting the 1776 half-boned stays. And while the book is fantastic in how clearly it lays out all the steps, there were many steps. I mean, like 6 pages covering 86 individual instructions before I even got to the boning channels type of many steps. It took a while, but it wasn't too tough. However, when I got to the boning channels, I started finding things a little bit more challenging.
So, like I said, the information it gives for the boning channels is very limited. There is a diagram, but there are no measurements whatsoever, except that it does state this gap from here to here, or on this piece from here to here, is 1.3 centimeters wide. That is the only measurement to give any context to how any of these bones are meant to be placed. I understand why, because the placement of the boning is going to vary depending on the body it's going onto. For example, the waist measurement that I've used for my pattern is for a smaller size than the bust measurement, and whereas on this diagram, the very top of the shoulder to the bust line is about the same as the bust line to the waist and the waist to the hip, on me, the distance from the top of the shoulder to the waistline is roughly equal that of the distance from the waist to the hip. So the boning channels won't look the same on mine as they do on this anyway. I've done my best to approximate. The reason there are 2 lines in each place there is a single line of boning here is because the instructions for this say the bone channels can be 1 centimeter wide or smaller depending on the width of the boning you purchase. The boning I'm going to be using is 0.5 centimeter wide, but I don't think that is going to be a significant enough amount of support and structure, so I marked out centimeter wide boning channels and split them in half so I have 2 lines of 0.5 centimeter boning. I don't know if this pattern is going to work at all. I am also entirely unclear how to deal with the horizontal bones, because this has 2 lines of boning going across the front, and the information the book gives about it says the horizontal bones are supporting bones and lie across the vertical bones to give the corset its conical shape. Lovely. I am completely unclear how to attach those bones, and have been puzzling it out in my head, and I've been pretty unsuccessful in trying to figure it out. There is seemingly, on this image, no horizontal stitching that is visible to secure the horizontal boning, but assuming that this is made the way many of the undergarments at the time were, and it is 2 layers of fabric sandwiched together, top-stitched to create boning channels, I don't understand how there is no visible stitching if there is a boning channel that contains these bones. I don't know. I think I might need to go look at some example images of 1770s half-bone stays, and hopefully I can find some that have some pictures of their insides. I'm gonna go do some searching for that before I start cutting this out. Okay, right, so I decided to be a reasonably sensible person, and before diving headlong into internet research, I decided to go back to the beginning of the section of this book about these stays and check there wasn't any information that would be useful there. There was useful information. Wonderful. Very exciting. Here it says, the channels of the bones are top stitched so they are visible on the right side of the stays, and the tabs flare out from the waist over the hips. The shaping bones are applied over the diagonal bones of the corset in a cotton tape. Very handy. Very useful to know. I also learned from reading that little section that the eyelets at the back are meant to be 2.5 centimeters apart, and I realised that the pattern that I drafted omits 2 horizontal boning channels.
So because I am a larger chested person, and I figured some additional structure couldn't go amiss, I added those 2 smaller horizontal bones to my pattern for the front panel. And then I was ready to start cutting out.
Okay, alright. The fabric I'd planned to use for this mock-up is very heavy black cotton fabric with a nice little jacquardy brocade pattern on it. I don't actually have enough of it to cut out both layers of the stays, and also it's kind of rough, so wouldn't be super comfortable close to my skin. So the second fabric I'm going to be using is this kind of limey pistachio green cotton canvas I have. There are other things in my stash I might be able to use to mock this up, but they're not really right in terms of the weight of the fabric or tightness of the weave, and I was just worried that they wouldn't stand up to the rigours of corsetry. So the black and the green are what we're going with. Let's get cutting out.
So I cut my black outer pieces and my green inner pieces, rough cutting around all the fiddly little tabs at the bottom of the stays, then going back in to cut the tabs out as precisely as I could.
Okay, so I have been stood for at least 10 minutes staring at these pattern pieces, trying to figure out what the best way to tackle the boning channels is, because I need to mark them out somehow, and there are a couple of options. One is that I thread mark them, but I'd be quite worried about the fabric shifting around and the markings being inaccurate. Also, that is a lot of thread marking. Another is that I just thread mark the beginning and end point of each of the channels and then open my pieces out to draw on the channels. But my concern with that is that the chalk will rub off after a while, as it is wont to do. And those were the main options I could come up with. And I've been backing and forthing about it, trying to figure out if there are other ways, and I can't think of any right now. So I think what I'm going to do is just add an absolutely ungodly amount of pins to this all around the boning channels to keep the fabric stationary while I thread mark them, and just hope for the best. But yeah, it seems I have a horrifying amount of thread marking ahead of me.
I then began what I internally referred to as the Great Anchoring, putting pins precisely across my pattern to ensure my fabric remained perfectly positioned. Then I did an absolute buttload of thread marking. I marked the entire length of the 2 outside lines on each set of boning channels, and I did a short little bit of thread marking on every centre line, mostly just to remind me they were there, honestly.
So much thread marking later, much thread marking later. I have my 2 outer back pieces with the straps pinned up ready to be sewn. I have the very carefully, madly, almost over thread marked back pieces with their boning channels laid out. I have a test of my thread tension and my boning channel size that I have done nicely here. And I'm honestly just terrified that all of my thread marking is going to come out and I'm going to lose all of that work that I did. But I don't think I can put it off any longer. I think I just need to start sewing things together. I'm just going to keep telling myself it's only a mock-up and hope for the best.
So after attaching the shoulder straps of the outer and inner back pieces, I put the 2 back pieces right sides together and stitched along the centre back. I pressed my centre back seams so they'd sit nicely, trimmed the excess off the seam allowance to remove any bulk, and moved on to the multitudinous lines of stitching needed to make the many channels for these stays' many bones.
Okay, so I was not planning on filming today. I was planning on cutting all the boning pieces for the 1 back piece I've completed and putting all of them in before I go back to stitching boning channels on the rest of the stays tomorrow. And I discovered something. So the last time I made any kind of stays, I made Regency Short Stays. And I found that I made my boning channels a little big. I think I made them 7 or 8 millimeters for 5mm boning. So this time round I thought I would correct that, and I made 5mm boning channels, which on the tiny test piece that I did, worked just fine. I found out through attempting to add the bones to the whole of this back piece, but the longer the boning channel is, the more difficult it is when it's too tight, and it is definitely too tight. So I think I overcorrected, and I need to fix that. Not on all of the boning channels, just on some of them. So I've unpicked a few, and I'm going to redo them, and I'm going to aim for 6mm boning channels on the second back piece and the front piece. I'm going to go redo some of my stitching now.
I restitched the various bits that needed restitching on my first back piece. Then I tied off and threaded in all the ends that needed it. And there were so many thread ends. So many. After that, I decided to start putting in the bones. And I found this a relatively tedious process because it isn't just a matter of inserting them. You need to cut them to the right length, cut the ends to be a decent shape for the channel, file the ends you just cut to smooth them out and make sure they won't catch or poke anything, and then you can put them into the channel you so painstakingly stitched for them. Also, particularly because of the choice I made to make 2 5mm channels in every place the pattern drafting instructions had one channel, there were a lot of bones to cut, shape, file, and insert.
So we are back, and we have 2 completed back pieces with almost all of their bones in. The only ones that aren't in are the ones that I need to wait to put in until the side seams are done and I'm putting the binding on. So it is time to tackle the front of these stays and probably do a little bit of thinking about how I'm going to finish the seams when I attach the back pieces to the front piece, but that is a problem for future Emily. The problem for current Emily is how I make myself power through the rest of this project when I am so unbelievably bored of stitching and filling boning channels. I have no other strategy beyond start in the middle of the front piece, put in all the really important lines of stitching, and just keep going until it's done. But oh my god, I'm so bored of the boning channels. So far this has been much easier to make than I thought it was going to be. It's just been repetitive and tedious. So I know I've been saying that this is a mock-up, but if it ends up fitting me, even decently, then this is probably going to just be the final version of the stays, because I don't think I could possibly make myself go through this process again, unless it is 100% absolutely necessary, and what my brain deems absolutely necessary. So we're gonna try our best with this front panel. For now, that's all we're focusing on. Front panel time. More stitching. Oh joy.
But before I could start stitching, I needed to open out my 2 folded front pieces, which meant oh so delicately, oh so carefully, cautiously pulling the 2 layers of my inner fabric apart and gingerly, daintily, meticulously cutting every single individual thread marking thread. Yes, it took ages, and yes, I was grumpy about it the entire time. But with that done, the inner and outer front pieces got pinned together with their right sides out, and it was back to the seemingly endless straight lines of stitching. Now, I know it probably sounds like I'm really over-egging how much stitching I needed to do, but partway through my second back piece, I started a new completely full bobbin of black thread, and about 2/3, maybe 3/4 of the way through stitching the boning channels for the front piece, that bobbin ran out. So yeah, much stitch, many thread. Anyway, I finished up my boning channels, hid all the thread ends, and prepped and inserted all the bones that I could to the front panel.
So finally, after putting 16 bones into each back piece and 52 bones into my front panel, it is time to attach my back pieces to my front piece. Put my final 8, I think, bones into this so I can finally do the first test fit. I have no idea when I will next be ready to cut and file and insert bones into channels I have stitched for them, but I don't think it's going to be for a while. There are more than 80 lines of stitching for the boning channels on the front panel. I'm so over it. Anyway, let's sew my back pieces to the front.
I pinned my 2 back pieces to the front, stitched them together, then inserted a bone into each of the 4 channels, sewing those seams had created. I planned to finish the side seams by trimming off just the seam allowance of the lining fabric and then cross-stitching the outer fabric seam allowance to the inside of the stays, but because I didn't want to completely finish the seams until after I'd tested how well the stays fit me, I roughly finished just the front side of the seam so I'd be able to add my horizontal bones on top of it, which Puddle was, for some reason, incredibly interested in.
What are you doing? I want attention, please. Give attentions to me. Betrayal.
After cutting all my horizontal boning pieces to the correct size, I used large diagonal stitches to secure them to one side of the tape they'd be encased in, then folded that tape over and stitched the sides closed. I sewed them to the inside of the stays as securely as possible, making sure my stitches wouldn't be visible on the outside by only sewing through the inner layer of fabric. It was then time to check if these were actually going to work at all. But I hadn't made any eyelets yet, so I tried to rig up a temporary way of lacing the stays using large safety pins as a kind of stand-in for eyelets. Then I chucked the stays on over a chemise-like layer, and finally, after hours and hours of work, got to see how well they fit me. So, ta-da! It's a pair of stays.
So usually I finish up my videos by presenting like a reveal footage montage of the finished garment in all of its glory. But it feels really weird to like do a full reveal shoot because it isn't completely finished. I haven't done my eyelets yet, I haven't done my binding, I just wanted to make sure the fit was decent before I did any of those steps, to make sure I didn't need to undo even more work if the fit was terrible. And from what I can tell, from like the jerry-rigging with safety pins that I did, the test fit, if you will, it's pretty good. I couldn't completely test the fit perfectly because one of my safety pins on the back pinged off partway through trying to lace it up, but I did get a decent impression of the fit, and good seems to be what the fit is. So now I can go in and do my eyelets and my binding, because I have also come to the conclusion that this is not a mock-up anymore. I played with this idea during the making process, but it is officially confirmed now. It's no longer a mock-up, it's a final thing. But it was a mock-up process, so that's what I thought I'd share with you. It's always interesting when I try taking on a project where I'm making something that I've never made before, because in my head I have an idea of roughly how long it might take me to complete it, and it is always wrong. Very occasionally, I hugely overestimate how difficult and time-consuming it's going to be, but honestly, the majority of time I massively underestimate how long it's going to take me. Making these was a slog, partly because it's not necessarily difficult. Like, there's a level of precision you need, but once the patterning part is done and you've cut it out and you're really starting to put it together, there's just a lot of repetitive tasks, like well over 100 lines of straight stitching to make boning channels. They're not difficult, but they need enough precision that you need to really focus on what you're doing. So there's a weird balance of it being really boring and lacking in any interesting complexity, but requiring a massive amount of mental focus, so you can't just like check out and think about other stuff. Which made it quite difficult to get through this one, I'm not gonna lie. We did get to mostly the other side of it, with a few bits left to do, and I'm very pleased with the result. I'm sure when they're finished they'll be absolutely lovely, but in the meantime I might take a break and work on another project for a bit. So thank you for joining me on this strange little journey. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to keep hanging out, that would be very cool indeed, but whether you decide to keep hanging out or not, I hope everything's okay in your world, and I will see you all next time. There, where is it? Do I look like a person? I do. Slightly red person, a person nonetheless. So warm, I'm so sweaty, and I'm so red on camera. This is what happens when I catch the sun or overheat. I lobster. Do not like.